Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this exciting webinar with Douglas Murray. My name is Sarah Greenbaum, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director here at the Pinsker Centre. The Pinsker Centre is a think tank comprised of students and young professionals. We host interviews, discussions, debates surrounding freedom of speech, British politics, and international affairs with specific emphasis on the Middle East in order to inform and to broaden the discussion around these important topics. To support our work and to support freedom of speech, please like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram and Twitter so that you can hear more about upcoming events and more about what we do. I'd now like to thank our partners on this event this evening. So thank you to the UCL International Relations Society, UCL Conservative Society, LSE Student Union Conservative Society, Manchester Young Conservatives, and the University of Warwick Conservative Association. Douglas Murray is an author of many books, his most recent of which are The Strange Death of Europe and The Madness of Crowds. He is also a journalist, contributing to The Critic magazine and The Telegraph, and is also an editor at The Spectator. He will be interviewed tonight by Charlie Woods, who is the Programmes Director at the Roger Scruton Centre and Vice Chair here at the Pinsker Centre. If you have any questions for our speaker, please pop them in the Q&A on Zoom or down below if you're in the Facebook comments. And if you're from a university, please put your name and the university that you're coming from. I leave you in Charlie's capable hands. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and welcome, Douglas. You've been the biggest pull I think we've ever had, and we're extraordinarily lucky to have you. My first question tonight, before we go into free speech, I wanted to ask you about your recent trip to the United States. You've just been touring across the US, and it's very notable, you said in a few interviews, that you don't like tipping points. But surely the electoral cycle and this resulting standoff following the election is a tipping point in of itself.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you all, and it's a very good first question. I have an aversion to the phrase tipping points and the analysis of political events as if, you know, they just rely on such things, because in my experience and observation, there never is a point, or at least there are so many things, and you think, well, that will be a tipping point. And conservatives are particularly prone to this, by the way. They're prone to saying, well, this is the moment where, because this terrible thing has happened, everybody will now realize through the terrible event that I was right all along. Maybe we're all susceptible to versions of that. But my experience is that lots of things happen that you would perhaps think would be inflection points at any rate, and they add up to an extent that you could not have foreseen. They add up perhaps sometimes, not always, to something slightly shifting in the gradient. But yes, individual events I tend to find are more easily ameliorated into history than we perhaps realize. The recent election, you're right, I've spent 5-6 weeks in the States. I'm not there any longer. I traveled across, I think, 6-7 states. And my view is that, yes, what's happening at the moment is a very worrying standoff of a kind. It's not unprecedented, though. It took weeks in 2000 for the eventual concession to be made in the presidential election. And in my view, what is happening, although a further deterioration in the body politic in America, is not completely new. And can I just I'll quickly explain why I think that is. In 2016, it's true that Hillary Clinton did not burrow into the Oval Office and then blockade herself within it. I give her that. However, she and many members of her party refused to acknowledge that Donald Trump had legitimately won the US election in 2016. With the rules in place, you can moan about electoral colleges and popular shares of the vote and much more, but in the rules that America has, he won in 2016. Donald Trump won fair and square. And many of the Democrats spent the next 4 years pretending that he had not. They talked about electoral interference, and they never showed any serious evidence of this. They said very freely, and I'm not talking about funny, fringe, wacky sources, that the Russians had manipulated the 2016 election. They never showed evidence for this, never any persuasive evidence for this. But they did that. They sang that for 4 years. And as I wrote somewhere recently, congratulations to all those people. Your child's just arrived. Your child is that now the Republican Party have a president, nominee, presidential contender, however you want to now name him, who doesn't accept the result of the 2020 election. And a poll just published yesterday said more than 8 out of 10 Donald Trump voters also don't think that Joe Biden won the election. And this is a very serious deterioration, but it's not entirely new. It's been emerging for some time. And let me add one other final point to that, if I may. As I see it, there's an underestimation. I write this in my Spectator column this week, in the magazine that's out today. There's a mistake or an underestimation that has been going on in particularly the international press, of exactly how bad the situation is politically in America. And it usually falls back on blaming the media. And the media in America is exceptionally biased, but they have a balance of bias. In Britain, we just have one directional bias. Everyone assumes there should be bias. It should just be left-wing bias. But in America, of course, the left bias is also countered by some right-wing media, which is also biased. And they have a sort of balance of power in that regard. None of that is the main issue. The inability to talk across political divides, that's not the issue. The issue is this: America no longer agrees on what it's just seen. It no longer agrees on what it's just seen. There's no point in talking about how you come together, how you unify. Now that Biden and Harris have won, or think they've won, appear to have won, they're talking about peace and reconciliation. Peace and reconciliation, of course, on their terms. And that's all well and good. You're not going to get anything like that if you can't even agree on what you've just seen. And if half the country thinks they've just seen Joe Biden win, and another half, or just a bit less than a half, thinks they've just seen Donald Trump win, then the rest is all theoretical.
Very interesting topic you've just picked up on, this idea of two realities emerging. Mm-hmm. What a lot of people who are plugging into and watching us for is this fact that they themselves are now experiencing this. We have a lot of young viewers here tonight who are at university, mm-hmm. and what they're seeing is this divergence of facts at mm-hmm. universities. What hope is there for academics, public intellectuals such as yourself, and even former politicians, to be able to express views if effectively they can be shut down at any point based upon one person's perception of what they have done or said? And I'm thinking in particular of the case of Amber Rudd, where she was cancelled at Oxford at the very last minute.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was a particularly pathetic one, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, the idea that Amber Rudd's some kind of fire-breathing right-wing maniac makes real fire-breathing right-wing maniacs worry. Amber Rudd is your sort of softest, milquetoast, boring, tedious, conservative, mainstream, bit left of the party politician. I mean, I can't help laughing when I see students thinking Amber Rudd is, the most right-wing figure you've ever seen. It just shows her own incredible ignorance and much more. But it's part of a pattern. I don't like belly aching, and I don't like it on the right, just I don't like it on the left. And I think there's quite a lot of belly aching on the right that goes something along these lines. Oh, we're being cancelled. Oh, I'm not allowed to speak here. Here are some ideas to how to get through that. I don't speak, well, when we could meet in public, I didn't often speak on university campuses. I used to about 10 or 15 years ago, and then I used to speak actually at different campuses most weeks, sometimes several times a week. I've spoken at most campuses in the UK, I think, at some point. I don't do it so much anymore, partly because it just, time doesn't permit it. But I've always enjoyed it when I do it, and it's always robust and always interesting. But I have noticed there's been a change. However, you can arrange these things to make sure you're not vulnerable. Let me give you an example. I've tended in recent years, when I have spoken, to speak to free speech associations, for instance, not because it's some weird way to smuggle in right-wing ideas through the back door of free speech, which is what some of the left now pretend, but just because if you're going to a free speech society, then you're already much more intelligent and grown up than your contemporaries. You're not in the kindergarten phase anymore. You don't have to be mollycoddled and have your hand held and have it explained to you that the world has big, nasty people with other opinions which you don't share. So here's where the grown-ups are meeting. Good. This is where the smart people hang out. And you can get a lot more done. You can get a lot more said, a lot more interesting discussion and debate and much more. But where they try to get you, where the sort of council people try to get you, is when they think you desperately want something. Like, this is one of the great grown-ups of recent years, of course, has been Germaine Greer. And you'll remember she was no platform for Manchester University some years ago, because she's become a kind of fire-breathing anti-feminist now, and really right-wing, right. Anyhow, Germaine Greer said very amusingly, when it was then sort of revoked and there was some petition to say, no, maybe Germaine Greer isn't a fire-breathing right-wing maniac, and maybe we should hear from the most important feminists of the late 20th century, and maybe it is possible for our delicate ears to bear it. And she was asked about it, and she said, sod it, I don't want to go. I don't want to. It's not that much of an honour. And that's my view. That's my view. You see, these stupid council people at Manchester seriously thought, well, the moment they heard that Germaine Greer was speaking, she was like, no, she can't speak on our campus. It's too important that we at Manchester don't sully our ears with an intelligent, brilliant woman's voice. But you see, they think it's a privilege, and they don't realise it's no damn privilege at all for Germaine Greer to speak anyway. She's more than established her reputation and her legacy and her body of work. So what you have to make sure is you never put yourself in the position, which I think Amber Rudd was in there, of being vulnerable to such a group. Now, here's the problem for everyone on the right at the moment, which is the left has control of an awful lot of institutions at universities as elsewhere. Well, here's the answer. Take those institutions back, or at least balance in them. These people who think Germaine Greer is some weird far right-wing maniac, who think that Amber Rudd is Adolf Hitler, these people are the ignorant minority. They are a minority in the population and elsewhere. So don't allow them the honor, don't allow them the bully horn, don't allow them the megaphone, don't allow them to go unchallenged. That's the most important thing. These people, whenever they're held up to the light, look as ridiculous as they should.
Interesting. So, in your opinion, then, cancel culture and this one-sided argument can only really be beaten if people, particularly not just of the right, but of many unpopular political positions that are still quite mainstream.
By the way, quickly, being right-wing is not unpopular.
No,
okay.
Not.
Conservatives have an 80-seat majority. This is another thing that we've got to not belly. We are not some small, weird, fringe group minority. Conservatism is the winning political position in the UK. It has been for generations. It's much more successful than the left, much more successful than Labour in all of its iterations, and it's in power at the moment. We all have criticisms, of course, but just to clarify that, like it's like the Brexit thing. People say things like, I voted, did you vote Brexit? And I say, yes, like the majority of the British public. So anyhow, I pass over to you.
No, thank you. I couldn't actually agree with you more. I think that's exactly right. You talk about conservatism being so popular, and I was just thinking, actually, it just brought me back to the memory of your two very popular mentors. you knew two great men who I believe quite well. You knew Christopher Hitchens personally, and you knew Roger Scruton. Both represented and argued for very, very different tradition. You know, Paine's radicalism and Burke's conservatism. I was wondering, you know, which of their ideas do you recommend that we learn more about and take on board as we take these sort of battles and discussions and arguments forward? And do we need these two thinkers particularly now more than ever?
Well, I mean, Christopher was a very, very brilliant man, a polemicist primarily. He was a verbal and literary pugilist, as well as being a very fine literary critic. I don't think Christopher had a body of, as it were, political thought that he certainly never put it between one set of hard covers. But Roger, of course, did leave us an extraordinary body of almost 50 volumes of all sorts of books, but many of which are very serious. I mean, they're all brilliant, but many of them in the non-fiction are very serious contributions to the history of political thought. And I thought that for any conservative, Roger's work is like Burke's, absolutely indispensable. Christopher was very unlike Roger. I mean, he was he was self-avowedly Marxist, I think almost to the end. I think if you'd have questioned him even at the end, he wouldn't have been able to completely ditch Marx. But he was the most brilliant arguer. When I was, he reviewed my first book, that's how I sort of came to know him. And the person who alerted me to him then said to me memorably, "There's only one rule of public speaking, Douglas." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Never appear on a stage before, with, or after Christopher Hitchens." And I actually only remembered that some years later when I was on a stage with Christopher, and I suddenly remembered, hang on, wasn't I? We don't take advice. No, but it was true because he was such a brilliant speaker. And I only mention that really because it's always worth testing your ideas out against the best. I think there are other figures of the left of his generation who wrote more theoretically about politics. In the end, I think most of the things that Christopher and I agreed on, I would have said were vaguely conservative. The most important thing is to read and contend with the best people from all sides. And by the way, one of the reasons why the right is, in my view, much more interesting and persuasive and successful includes the fact that we actually do that. I can never stress this enough. The experience throughout my life has been that I go into studios or I stand on debating platforms and I've done my work and I've read the books, the turgid, very poorly selling tomes of my adversaries. And sometimes literally I think I'm the only person who's bought the damn thing. That actually happened to me last year with a contributor to The Guardian. Her ill-selling book, I actually had to get it from the bookshop and it was on a stand at the back and they only had 2 copies and I bought one. I think it's the only one that's sold. But I do this. And I do it because I think you should do your damn homework, know what you're up against and know what you're dealing with and know what arguments they can come with. Here's the thing, they never return the favor. They never return the favor. In fact, that particular occasion with that Guardian contributor, at the end of the program, the interviewer said, did Douglas say anything that surprised you? And she said, no, because I knew what he was going to say. And I said, which of my books have you read? And she hadn't read any of them. She hadn't read any of them. She just had this magical ability that the left thinks it has. It's not as clever as it thinks it is. This magical ability to not read the right books or indeed articles. They don't even make it through an 800-word article. And yet to divine what we've said. I think this is why they lose. I think this is why they don't persuade publics, among other things, not the only reason. I think their arguments are stale. I think they're stale. I think they're incurious. So I think that people who are smart, whatever their political persuasion, but it seems to be more common on the right, should read as widely as you can among the people you think you might. I know, read Tom Paine, for God's sake, as well as Burke, and yeah, read the best left-wing writers that you can find. I mean, there are some out there; they're mainly dead, but yeah.
This leads me on to a quick follow-up question, which is, is there anybody on the sort of modern woke left who you've read, who you have some kind of respect for, or whose argument you've gone, maybe there's something to this?
Well, there's often something to it. I mean, there's often something to it. One thing I have found is that there is a problem of, I don't want to get too theoretical, but we'll stop here. But there's a problem in a part of what the left is doing at the moment, which goes as far as, which is it ends up being almost entirely autobiographical. So it says, I extrapolate out from my own experience the following injustices in the world. And sometimes they go on to say, here is my diagnosis for how we can then solve all the injustices of the world. The problem in that, of course, is that it can be, it's not impossible, it can be, it's actually tricky to argue with people on the basis of evidence of memoir. And that is something which is, I mean, rife. I can't overstate this. If you're left-wing, and particularly, by the way, if you're an ethnic minority and you're left-wing, you can get a book deal for a memoir very, very easily. Most people, certainly anyone who was right-wing, and certainly if they were white, and they were in their early 20s, would find it hard to get a memoir published. It would not be presumed that what you had gone through in your life was significant enough. But if you take a figure from the States like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who presumes to be one of the most put upon and prejudiced against writers imaginable, but is a recipient of almost every award going, he had 2 memoirs by the time he was 30. And still talks about his oppression. So I find that it's interesting always to read a personal story, even with somebody like Coates, because you think, okay, I can see where you're coming from. I might disagree with, or do disagree with where you're extrapolating out from there. But there's often something, or at least very rarely nothing, in the whole book that's, that doesn't stimulate anything. The problem I have with a lot of my opponents, what I think of as people I'm opposed to's writing, is that it's so damn impenetrable, and it's so incredibly boring and staid and stuffy, and it puts things in more complicated manner than it needs to. Can't simplify any idea. It just can complexify very simple ideas, and is also unbelievably lacking in wit, which is a terrible giveaway. Yes,
it's very interesting, because it seems that a lot of the writers who have followed James Baldwin have never been able to meet that kind of standard. I mean, Baldwin writes beautifully because he talks about the African-American experience, but
yes,
at the same time, he recognizes the problems, the nuances. He says what he sees as wrong within the various movements that he encounters. And I just feel that today, and I don't know if you agree, that the modern movement for rights in particular, and perhaps we might want to touch on Black Lives Matter a bit with this, there doesn't seem to be the same outreach to a common humanity, which James Baldwin captures beautifully in his writings. And I think that just seems to lack in a lot of these modern writings that particularly are on our shelves or back of bookstores.
Well, yes, I'm very interested in Baldwin. I mean, I think he was an exceptional figure as a writer, as a moral force. Again, I mean, there's a lot in Baldwin I disagree with, but wow, I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to have absorbed him and to continue to absorb him. I mentioned in The Manners of Crowds that extraordinary leap that has occurred in in Black American writing from Baldwin to Coates. By the way, I have quite a funny story about that, if I can stretch my legs and say. A couple of years ago, I had a great time touring Australia and New Zealand with my friend Cornel West, distinguished academic, and by his own description, Christian revolutionary. We don't see we don't see eye to eye on everything, but I admire Cornel enormously, and he's been an extraordinary voice. He dared to say somewhere that Ta-Nehisi Coates is. I think Toni Morrison said somewhere that Coates made up for the great gap left since the death of James Baldwin, and Cornel West said that's not true at all. He said Coates was absolutely furious about this. He couldn't believe that somebody had said that he wasn't James Baldwin. It's a very, very telling piece of arrogance, you know. Douglas, I don't quite find your writing up to the standard of, you know, Shakespeare. How dare you? How dare you? Yes, the interesting thing is, of course, to do with charity. That's the really interesting one. Baldwin, who went through real racial segregation in the US, has charity towards other people left in his armory, which is one of his great moral strengths. And I think that Coates, and particular people now, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Kendi and others. I mean, these are really foul individuals, I think. I think they're dangerous hucksters. Robin DiAngelo, all this stuff is dangerous, ugly, retributive stuff. I wish we could get out of this as fast as possible. Get these fraudsters to one side as fast as possible.
One of the concepts that is taught or argued for by a lot of the authors and writers and thinkers you've just mentioned is this very strange idea of whiteness as a conception, as an idea and not a condition of DNA, which I think people find very, very bizarre. But you know, when you have policy that is being written based upon this, you know, abstract concept, where does that leave a society such as ours, a democracy that seeks to be equal for everyone? Because it seems that the great challenge from the sort of woke left has been that, you know, that they are focused on these concepts that are threatening to minorities, and therefore they change the language in order to change the conversation, in order to give themselves power over others.
Oh yeah, that's all it is. You're quite right. I mean, it's a search for power. It's a demand for power. And by the way, I mean, almost everyone is bullied to some extent by this. I wrote recently that one of the great challenges, one of the great worries of the age is that, this was something that Roger Scruton and I talked about quite a lot at the end of his life actually, was what you do in an era where the great sins of which you can be accused cannot be disproven. It is like the witch era. You couldn't prove you weren't a witch. Likewise, you can't actually prove you're not a racist. I mean, there are enough, a legion examples now of people who are black who are accused of racism, or of an ethnic minority group who are accused of racism. It's happened left, right, and centre. Well, mainly right and centre. But this is, it's an attempt to seize power. And I believe that we've left ourselves vulnerable. My friend Eric Weinstein in America made this point very, very bravely, I thought, as well as characteristically lucidly, after the death of George Floyd, where he said, we have come to the position in America where no white person can say anything negative about anyone who's black without fearing the whole damn thing falls down on them. And what I'm talking about there is not that people should be allowed to, or want to, or should get away with being racist. Of course not. I'm talking about the fact that people can't say no. It's worse than that. I mean, an example that was on my mind in America in recent weeks was if the morbidity rates are higher among, the death rates are higher among Black Americans than others, as within the UK from COVID, where BAME communities appear to be suffering disproportionately, you would want to find out why that is. So far, the only thing our societies can do is to say it's because of racism, as if we can't import even a Chinese virus without giving it our own racist spin. But I would have thought the most obvious is that there are issues of obesity, particularly in America. And then that's not just in Black communities, by the way, but issues of obesity, underlying health issues like diabetes, which is slightly higher, just a higher proportion in Black communities. I would have thought these are the sort of things you'd start to talk about. But no, they can't even do that. They can't even have that conversation in the States. And so it's this very, very dangerous terrain. And here's the thing, as Eric Weinstein put it, he said, if I can't tell you when you're wrong, you're not my equal. If I can't tell you when you're wrong, you're not my equal. And I worry that everybody is caught up in what I regard as being its most benign form, seen as some kind of overcorrection. There has been racism in the past, as there has been sexism and homophobia and all of these things. I don't deny the existence of these things in the past. What I say is, I doubt that overcorrecting is the best way to sort this out. I doubt that saying the Black community had it bad at points in the past, so let's give it to whitey for a time. I doubt that's a very good way to get racial equality. I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's going to set off a massive booby trap at some point. Just as I don't think it's the best way to get absolutely equal rights for women in every sphere of life to do down men, or to say that masculinity is toxic or anything else, or to say there's something wrong with masculinity. I don't think any of this is a good idea. I know it's not, and I'm desperately trying to warn people not to play this game.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one more question and then quickly switch on to our questions from our fantastic audience. There seems to be an exception made, particularly when it comes to cancelling people, and a virulent form of hatred within cancel culture, which is directed specifically at Israelis. And this is a very unusual target, because very often these speakers can be very moderate, they can be left-wing even.
Yes.
But at the same time, they're absolutely hated, not because of what they say or what they write, but for who they are. And I'm wondering, why is it that cancel culture particularly, or the far left who propagate cancel culture, particularly seek them out? Is it that cancel culture leads to anti-Semitism, or does anti-Semitism lead to cancel culture?
Well, I think we can safely say what came first. Anti-Semitism has been around for a very, very long time. Much longer than the cancel culture. It predates it. But you're right that a version of it has been being, as I say, I'm not wild about the term cancel culture, but I mean, a version of it obviously has been applied for some time by anti-Semites and their fellow travelers who try to hide behind the cloak of anti-Semitism by pretending they merely dislike the one Jewish state. And I mean, I've seen this for years. My friend Marty Peretz, for instance, some years ago, former owner of the New Republic, that used to be the most distinguished organ of the American left. I remember some years ago, Marty Peretz was the subject of huge demonstrations at, was it Yale or Harvard? And it was so funny. I mean, a friend of mine in Tel Aviv said to me, what are these idiots? Well, they think Marty Peretz is some right-wing maniac, you know? And it's the same all the time. From figures of the Israeli left. I mean, Zippy Livni, some years ago, I interviewed her in London in a public event just after the it was made clear she could come to the UK. But I mean, like, Zippy Livni is not some right-wing maniac. I happen to disagree with her on almost everything. But I mean, you get these kind of leftist Israeli politicians, doesn't matter, they're still Jews. Still Jews willing to defend their historic homeland. So they're seen as being the most right-wing people imaginable. It happens all the time. I mean, Hen Matsick, I know a little bit. He's young, really left. I mean, I wish there was something one could do about it. But very brave, happens to be gay, Israeli. He gets the same. He gets the same stuff as if I don't know. I don't mean Shin Bet isn't a right-wing organization, but it's as if the head of Shin Bet was coming to campus. They have no ability to differentiate. It comes back to this thing of the ignorance of the opposition. They have no interest in differentiating between anyone if they've got an Israeli passport. So, but I mean that's been going on for decades. It's a very, very long established and disreputable part of the left. I mean, there is right-wing anti-Semitism, as we all know, and there has been right-wing anti-Israelism, but it's pretty much died out in the mainstream. You still get it occasionally in Britain. People who sort of, talk about the mandate and Irgun and this sort of thing, but it's died out by and large. Whereas, of course, on the left, it's been doing awfully well.
I think we should move on to questions from our audience now. And I'm looking at a question from Lily, who's at UCL. She's a young conservative, and she's a US delegate, but she's found that herself and other young conservatives have been censored when they go to events. What advice do you have, particularly for young conservatives who are going into these bodies such as student unions or the National Union of Students? How can they best exercise their freedom of speech?
Well, I mean, I would say that freedom of speech is something you don't just talk about, it's something you do, and it's a shame there are so many people who need kind of freedom of speech 101 lessons, but maybe they do. With the NUS and things, you're dealing with something that's always been a crazy left-wing organization and sort of feeds crazy left-wing people into the Labour Party, where they're then a slightly less crazy left-wing for the rest of their lives. But they really stretch their legs when they're in the NUS. I mean, the temptation is to just give up completely on any involvement in those sorts of things. I don't know. I admire the people who do get involved. I really do, and I think people should. The problem always, by the way, in right-left activism is this. It isn't quite so, what Lily thinks about this, but it isn't quite the same in America, because there is a sort of Republican activism that is quite organized and quite outgoing. British right-wing conservatism, it tends to want to sort of get on with other things, and this is, of course, a reflection of the difference between the left and the right-wing character, because the left-wing character tends to want to endlessly struggle and go forward and fight, and broadly speaking, conservatives just want to get on with their lives, and they don't see purpose in turning out every Saturday morning, to protest against, the latest figure of hate or the latest shop of hate or anything else. It's sort of less in our nature. It's something I'm very interested in, why that is. But it means that it requires an extra effort for conservative-minded people to get involved in things, because our inclination is that one would like the optimal conditions for human flourishing to exist, and then, we get on with it. So it is always a problem, but it is worth getting involved, particularly at this, the NUS, as I say, I salute anyone who wishes to lash their head against that wall. More fruitful, I'd have thought, would be doing it university by university. I've always found, by the way, that UCL, I haven't spoken there for some years, but UCL is one of the campuses in the UK that's rather more distinguished in the intelligence of its student body. I don't want to start naming universities where I think the students are real dunces, but UCL, in my experience, has always been more than usually filled with stimulating, diverse, thoughtful people. And And as a result, by the way, people will leave there, if that is the case, will leave there much better prepared for life and much better educated and much better informed, and they'll be wittier, funnier, richer, more successful than some weird automatons churned out by an institution which thinks that the whole world thinks like the sociology department of a second-tier university, which a lot of people seem to think.
Peter from Durham asks, he says that in your book, The Madness of Crowds, you speak about the declining influence of religion in modern public discourse. What, if anything, should replace religion as a marker of good moral and political character in our society?
Well, that's a $1 million question. It should start from the acknowledgement that it's possible that it can't be done. I write about that a bit in The Strange Death of Europe. It's possible that the God-shaped holes can't be filled with anything other than God. And I say that as a non-believer. But it's possible. Our society has huge numbers of God-shaped holes. It's possible that the gap left by religion can't be filled by anything else, can't be filled by yoga, can't be filled by charity work or good deeds, can't be filled by reading a good book every month. And I think that there's a requirement of humility. It's an argument against interests, because if I was just sort of selling something, I would say, oh, that's easy. I know exactly how to fill that up. I don't. I think it's extremely hard to say how you fill it up. The religious impulse is obviously ineradicable in us as humans, and some people lament that fact, and others think it might be one of our saving graces. I think that a degree of humility on behalf of secularists and atheists and agnostics wouldn't go amiss, and I think that it's a mistake to war on the origins of things that have got you where you are. And that's why my own view is that one remains in the position of not warring against origins. In the same way that I don't war on Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, not just because I don't want to, but because I think it's one of the things that's got us where we are. And I think in a way it would be as strange as it would be if I spent part of my life pointing out the personal moral failings of Aristotle. I don't see where it would get us, especially. And I think one of the mistakes of modern Western thought has been the idea that you can saw off the branch that you're sitting on and that it won't have any consequences. But I mean, what we are seeing at the moment, it's a very important question. It's a very deep question, because what we are seeing from identitarianism of the left these days is an attempt to replace religion. As I say in both my last two books, it's clearly going on. It's an unsuccessful attempt to replace religion, but it'll run. It'll have a go at it, and it's already got all of the attributes: the heretics, the heresies, the dogmas, the indulgences. It's got absolutely everything. It's got the canon. It's got the holy texts. I just preferred the old religion.
With a lot of people like Sam Harris and A.C. Grayling, and Steven Pinker even, they've argued that philosophy and this kind of scientism, maybe I'm not doing them justice, but they've argued that ultimately should replace this religious impulse. Yeah. What would you say to that? Because there are others, such as Roger Scruton, who said, this is not really possible, that humanity craves that is beautiful. Yes. Ernest Renan said that, humanity thirsts for the ideal.
Yes.
So is there a way to reconcile religion with philosophy? In other words, can you reconcile people such as your mentors, Christopher Hitchens and Roger Scruton, their very different approaches to life in this sense?
No, I think it's always the battle. It's, by the way, it's the battle and it's the friction which has in part propelled the modern West. It's not just the modern West, I mean, the legacy of Athens and Jerusalem. It comes from this tension. It comes from this ever unanswerable but necessary to question dialectic, to use a somewhat surprising and possibly dated term. I'm not confident, as some of my atheist friends are, that you can replace religion with philosophy. First of all, because philosophy has never ever been and is not likely to be a practice of more than a small percentage of the population, for lots of reasons, which hardly need to go into, but it's always going to be a minority practice. The view of Schopenhauer and others that basically religion does the job of holding together what philosophy can't bring to the masses, but that religion can. I'm say bastardizing Schopenhauer's view, but it's something along those lines. Is one defense of religion, although it doesn't, of course, prove its truth. It proves the utility. But I'm also uncomfortable with what Sam and others argue. I said this to Sam on stage a couple of years ago at the O2 Arena, we did an event with Jordan Peterson. I said this to him, but that, you know, I fear that one of the things that we've been learning in the last few years is that the Enlightenment didn't go anywhere near as wide or deep as some of us had expected it had. You can see that, by the way, in the behavior of the people on the modern left who wish to cancel people. I mean, this is what is this but a demonstration that they didn't drink from the Enlightenment well. They managed to dodge that. So if it is the case that the Enlightenment didn't go as far or as deep as we thought, then the idea that it can, in our lifetimes or any time in the future, actually spread out and replace religion, tout court, I think, would be a presumptuous claim.
Eamon from UCL asks, do you think that the West has anything to learn from Eastern societies, especially Russia and Eastern Europe, about social cohesion and cultural integrity?
Yes, this is the sort of question which, of course, immediately causes a landmine to explode, but I'm grateful for the chance to tread on it. Yes, I do. I mean, I think that, by the way, I think without dodging the specifics of it, which I'll come to, I think that everyone has something to learn from everyone else. I mean, I'm not being sort of entirely syncretic in my view, but I do think that you always learn something from another culture, another place. I've written fairly widely now about the differences that have opened up between East and West in Europe. It saddens me that the divide has become larger than one expected it to be after 1989, 1990. But I take the I think, true position, but which is also controversial, that it's not just the East that has gone wrong. You know, I think that Western Europe has lost its way in lots of ways, and that I don't like the interpretation. Russia I know less about, but Eastern and Central Europe I know pretty well. And it's my view that their decision not to follow Western Europe in all sorts of ways is a perfectly reasonable one. And if they decide that's for them, then they should be respected for that. I think that there are things we could learn from countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I regret that there is this presumption. It's an extraordinary presumptuous stance that so many people in Britain, America, really it's Britain and America have, that Eastern and Central Europe just have to sort of catch up with us. As if we're so obviously attractive, why wouldn't they want to be like us? I mean, very quickly, family policy is a very good example. I mean, people cite the Hungarian and Polish governments' desire to, instead of having immigration, to encourage people in their own country, and indeed to try to counter some of the internal EU immigration that goes on when they're young, to have policies, taxation policies and elsewhere, that encourage young people in their countries to have children. This is almost always portrayed in the Western European and American press as some kind of fascist policy, as if encouraging your own population to have children is just a sort of unbelievably backward idea. This is Western. This is a Western flaw, not an Eastern European one.
Yes, we see similar policies with attempts to keep talent in the country from countries such as Guyana, actually, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ghana.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, why wouldn't you? Why would you want to always see the people you've educated the best in your country go elsewhere?
I think it's Taman from the University of Warwick asks, does our heavily institutionalized society now mean that we should be ready to accept that freedom of speech is gone forever, and the constructed moral frameworks around what we can say will forever taint our freedom of expression? I think this relates to this ever-increasing body of legislation and policy that you've touched upon brilliantly in your book, The Madness of Crowds, which attempts to, again, regulate the thought, the speech of the individuals who are subject to it.
I'm sort of confident about this one in a way. I believe that the Conservative government in Britain has not done enough to counter this. I believe that it needs to strip out what I describe as the moral asbestos of things like diversity training, a need to prove a commitment to diversity, and much more. I obviously explained that, what the reasons for that are. This is the imbibing of a very radical left-wing and divisive ideology into the heart of government. I'm not very much interested in hearing Conservatives moaning about universities and what they teach when they allow the civil service to teach much worse. You know, I really find it contemptible when ministers take easy things to hit and don't deal with their own problem. I'm generally sort of rather optimistic about this one. You could say it's just because of my own experience, but you know, I write what I think, I say what I think. I suppose I'm not universally loved, but nobody is, and I wouldn't wish to be. I certainly wouldn't wish to be loved by some of my enemies. And I find that I can say what I think in a very jolly, unbothered fashion. I don't find myself beleaguered or anything else. And I simply want as many people as possible to be in that same position of being able to say what they think. And so maybe, you know, I could, to use a word I don't like, I could say that I'm in a position of privilege because of that. It would be different if I worked in a government department, or increasingly, sadly, in the private sector, let alone in the university sector. But you know, we have had much worse situations in the past in history where people can't speak, and they have been righted. I mean, actually, just to go back to that point about Central and Eastern Europe, you know, and actually ties one of your first questions about Roger Scruton. You know, the worst in times in Czechoslovakia, as it then was, and Hungary and Poland. These were societies which were taught, I mean, lies were totally embedded in the entire society. Everybody, to get through the day, had to tell and imbibe lies. But Roger and a group of other academics from across the political spectrum, actually in the UK, had a moral integrity and a force which I'd like to think would still be there today. I don't know, given some of the people who pollute academia in Britain, but a range of academics, at some risk to themselves, went to these countries and they taught seminars. It was known as the Underground University. They taught seminars in which they brought Plato and the classics to willing, volunteering students who otherwise weren't able to access this stream of thought. And, you know, the fascinating and wonderful and very moving thing about that was that when the wall fell, when communism ended, so many of those people who had been students at the Underground University ended up in positions of power in all of these countries. Because, among other things, the people who had learned the truth and imbibed the truth were of much more significance after the society gave up on the regime of lies. So I'm confident that if that could happen in those days, then we can get that right in our own, where we live in a much less benighted system and where the opportunity to correct these things is much better. I return to that thing about not liking belly aching. Quite often conservatives behave as if they were in the position of dissidents in Eastern Europe. I don't underestimate the problem, but we're not in that situation in Britain, and pray God we never will be. And so people have to speak up, and you have to assert your rights, you have to assert your own voice, and you have to not put up with the crap that's thrown your way. And you have to say, absolutely not. I will not be told that I'm some fringe when I represent a majority opinion. I will not be intimidated and bullied by people. I'll not be told to educate myself by people who are visibly less educated than the people that they're talking to, and much more. I won't put up with it. The more people do that, the more we can spread this around, the less it will rely on a few people having to carry too much of a burden. And I'm hopeful that can happen. All we need is more smart and brave people, and I think we're getting them. We're getting them.
Yeah. Fantastic. I'd love to ask you two more questions, Douglas, before I let you go, if that's okay. The first question is from Sarah in Durham, and she asks she follows up a little bit on what you've just said about the changing minds of young people, particularly going from millennial to Gen Z and further, that these groups actually tend to be much more individualistically minded, much more free thinking. Does this give you hope, or do you think it's just one of these things that conservatives in particular are telling themselves in order to bolster their own fear, bolster their own sense of security? Sorry.
Well, no. I mean, I genuinely think that where the smart people are is what I'm speaking about. I think probably with the people who joined us tonight. I think that's where the smart people are. The smart people aren't with the weirdo doctrinaire. You've got to walk lockstep with the latest thing we just made up yesterday. They're not with that. The boring doctrinaire left keeps failing at elections, keeps being rejected at the ballot box. It's unappealing to all but a weird small doctrinaire sect of very ugly and unpleasant people. And I'm not. This can't be stressed enough. They're like some strange little Puritan sect, and they want to tell everyone what to do in every aspect of our lives. They want to police sex. They want to tell people how, where, and when they should have sex. I'm fairly confident that intelligent, reasonable people don't want to be told that by strange doctrinal bigots of the radical left who are making stuff up as they go along. And it's the same on issue after issue. Don't tell me what I can say. Don't tell me what language I can or cannot employ. Especially don't do it when you've only just made up your latest language change 24 hours ago. So I don't find, I'm not willfully optimistic on this. I don't find that those people are likely to get any more appeal than they already have. They can use intimidation, and they've got lots of words that they throw around to try to silence people and scare people. But they've not got much more, and they've got no wit, and they've got no humor and no sense of irony, and much more. They've just got a boring doctrinal set of claims and assertions which they wrap up in unappealing language. And I think they'll lose. Or they'll continue losing.
Yes. You've just written last week a absolutely terrific piece for the Spectator on the horrendous situation in France at the moment, where France has suffered an absolute tragedy. I believe 4 people now dead. Samuel Paty murdered for simply teaching a class on freedom of expression.
Yeah.
Followed shortly by an attack in Austria, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote that Emmanuel Macron finds himself now, the French find themselves now very isolated in Europe. And you say that this is to our shame.
Yeah.
What can we do to stand up for our values, to stand up against this very, very worrying evil that we've faced? And how do we resist this idea of a new normal? Because we remember the Paris attacks. We remember when leaders went to Paris after the Paris attacks and stood in the streets with Francois Hollande and said, oh, we will not let this happen again. And now they're gone. Now they're gone. And what do we do as the younger generation to take this challenge on?
Let me cite some surprising sources. First of all, a left-wing writer, and secondly, a left-wing word. Firstly, a left-wing writer. During the Satanic Verses controversy in 1989, when the Ayatollah Khomeini threatened or called for the death of a British novelist for the crime of writing a novel, there were writers in America, as there were in Britain, who stood alongside Rushdie. There were also writers who, to their eternal shame, carried out acts of vengeance on Rushdie by saying he deserved it, or much more. Susan Sontag, perhaps not somebody people would expect me to cite very much, and a bit of a windbag, a self-regarding windbag at her worst, nevertheless had one of her great moments and helped organize a reading from the Satanic Verses in New York, in which some of the great writers of the day appeared and read portions of the book. And Susan Sontag then said something which is very important to have now. She said, what we need is a bit of civic courage. We need a bit of civic courage. And the left-wing word I wanted to use is one which I wish the right had more of, and that's solidarity. Solidarity is an incredibly important concept. It seems not to be something that's quite so natural for a lot of people on the right. People let their own hang rather too often, in my experience and sight. But solidarity is one of the great ideas, the great principles of the left, and I am particularly for it in cases like this with France. I want a bit of civic courage and I want a bit of solidarity. I'm actually just writing a piece at the moment for one of the French papers, expressing my own admiration that I've been writing about elsewhere in recent weeks for the Republic. I think that if you took almost any other society and saw multiple attacks of this kind, we've had attacks in Britain as well, of course, had attacks almost everywhere. But if you took what happened in 2015, the year starts with the murder of all the most prominent secularists in France, and it finishes with the slaughter of a priest at the altar of his church in Rouen as he's saying mass. That's a pretty total assault on a nation, just there. And it's just happened again last month, from Samuel Paty to the 3 people hacked at, indeed decapitated, as they're leaving church in Nice. Now, I don't think any other country I can think of would have borne this, would have been able to go through this without very unpleasant things happening as a result of very ugly events. And France has, and I enormously admire the French Republic for this. It doesn't stick in my throat at all to say that and to credit it. And I think it needs to be said more often, and with more love and more solidarity. And I would just add to that if there is a reason why it seems to be hard, it is because of something that's gone wrong on the American left. I'm delighted that Emmanuel Macron has written to the Financial Times and actually phoned the New York Times, 2 distinguished former papers, and told them why and how they've got his country wrong. I want more of this. It's the American left that's gone rotten. It's the American left that's gone rotten. The French left can do all the leftist stuff, it can do all the trade union organizing, and it can still love its country. It's the American left that is increasingly been thinking that to be on the left is to loathe your country, to be ashamed of it. And so this terrible putrid thing on the American left has spilt out elsewhere and has made the American left think that even when the French Republic is defending itself on left-wing terms, that it is in some way racist and much more. Well, this is their damn problem. It's not the problem of France. And I'm delighted that Emmanuel Macron is standing up. And I'm delighted and emboldened by the fact that he's not the only one. Manuel Valls, when he was Prime Minister, was just as strong on this. I admire them. I salute them. I think they need a bit more encouragement and love. And if you can't show love for France, then you can't show love for anything. So yeah, a bit more of it. And I love it from Boris Johnson, but he seems to be distracted. I can understand why, but everything's always going on. It's no. He missed an important moment to show solidarity, but then so did Chancellor Merkel. So, yeah, I wish they hadn't, but.
Do you think that one argument that could be used is pointing out the very obvious fact that someone like, a rabble-rouser like Mr. Erdogan, Sultan of Turkey, will condemn France and say that President Macron is, deluded, but has, said absolutely next to nothing about the fact that Uyghur Muslims are being shipped into camps, their body parts used for, trade effectively, their hair and so forth. I mean, surely this obvious fact would help us understand that these groups are just, self-serving, nasty liars.
Everybody who studies Middle Eastern politics or the Islamic world at university still, I find rather shockingly, has to read the Edward Said book on Orientalism, and it's there's certainly so many destructions of that book now by my friend Ibn Warraq and others. I mean, I'm surprised it's still standing as a book, but you hear it trotted out by these particularly undergraduates who think they know everything because they've imbibed a little bit of Said. But I mean, there is an interesting version of it that goes of what he's trying to talk about, which goes on in our own day, which is the presumption, the extraordinary presumption that people like Mr. Erdogan actually mean what they say in this stuff. It's the same thing with Imran Khan, the former cricketer and playboy, and now the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who pretends he's some stern-faced mullah. He's a double-faced little toad. He's an appalling piece of work. I loathe Imran Khan's behavior. I was at a conference with him once in Delhi, where the Indian interviewer absolutely eviscerated Imran Khan, quite rightly, by saying, "Which Mr. Khan have we got today?" But here is Imran Khan, total playboy, doesn't believe a word of it, but needs to rally people in a country whose economy he can't improve, and the living standards of the people in which are miserable in the majority. And here's this man who then vies for some kind of leadership by insulting France and lying about France. And then you have Mr. Erdogan, who's simply another person auditioning to be the leader of the world's Muslims, as he sees it, the great caliph. There's Mr. Erdogan just making stuff up about France, lying about France. It's not that they're mishearing. It's not that they can't hear when Macron makes a very clear delineation between Islam, the religion, and the Islam of the Enlightenment, and then the Islam of the terrorists. It's not as if they can't hear that. They hear it and they ignore it because they don't want it. That doesn't fit their game. It doesn't fit their game. What they want to do is to increase their constituency at home and radicalize their base and grow. Well, to hell with these people, to hell with Erdogan. I'm delighted that Macron's removed the ambassador. I'm delighted he's calling for Turkey to have their trade arrangements with the EU scrapped. I want to see Turkey punished for this. I'd like to see Pakistan punished for it. I don't know why the hell we give any foreign aid to a country whose leader insults our friends and allies in France. I don't want a penny to go to them. I don't want any country in NATO, like Turkey, that lies as they have about France. So No, it's another one. You just need some more backbone, and and I'd like, by the way, to see a bit of that from our Conservative Prime Minister and our Conservative government. I don't want these Conservatives who think that the conservatism is purely about saving the whale, as if right-wingers traditionally were just all for whale massacring, as if hitherto we never saw a whale we didn't want to kill. I'm not for that. This is the easiest stuff. This is the simplest stuff. This is the kumbaya. This is the kiddie stuff. I want to see some grown-ups on the international stage, and I'm delighted we've got a bit of that from Mr. Macron. I'd like to see a bit of it more from Boris Johnson. I think we should demand more. Otherwise, I would like to see his majority eaten away at. I'd like to see him having 10 points nibbled from a party further to his right, and I think he'd deserve it.
And on that terrific note, I think we will have to end. Douglas Murray, thank you so much. As always, thank you for being so eloquent. Thank you for being so strong. Thank you for giving us so much to think about. And I think we'll leave on that important note of solidarity. So to all our viewers tonight, thank you. And thank you, Douglas.
Thank you, and solidarity to all of you.